Welcome to the Equipping Leaders Podcast Leader Study Series. I'm Natasha, a leader development professional and overall leadership enthusiast.
And I'm Corey, a program manager and an emerging people leader, and thus a leadership enthusiast.
We're doing a leader study of the TV show Z Nation, deconstructing the leaders, decisions, and team dynamics of the characters on the show to look at how leadership is all around us. And even if we're not in a position of leadership, we can still demonstrate it in our actions, responses, and opportunities.
Z Nation aired from 2014 to 2018, but if you haven't seen it yet, there will be spoilers in these episodes. Today, we're finishing up the series with an overview of the leadership arcs across the main characters. Let's jump in.
Okay, we are back with our final episode of this leader study series. And so what we're going to do today is we're breaking down the different characters and their leader journey and just kind of showing that leader arc that occurred through all 5 seasons of Z Nation. And then I know I have some questions for you as to kind of how you've changed your mind about things or some things that you're going to take into your leadership journey. So I'll kick it over to you. Who do you think, like when you think of Z Nation, who's the first leader from the series who comes to mind?
Warren, for sure. Roberta, right? She's, I think, the first main, she's the first big leader that you meet. And what I also think is interesting is when you first are sort of introduced to her, she isn't the de facto leader of the group that she's in, right? She's sort of more like a lieutenant, right? Of just sort of learning the ropes, and she has someone she's listening to and seeing that mentor and guidership. And then so you meet her at the very beginning stages of having been this sort of apprentice to leadership to now not against her will, but right, extreme circumstances, was thrust into a leadership position.
I agree. Yes, that's the first person who comes to my mind too when I think of Z Nation and leadership. And I think that her arc throughout the series too is super interesting because, like you said, she didn't start off as the person who was acknowledged as the leader, and then she definitely became that. And then also had some trials along the way where you kind of question some of her decision making, but just kind of pointing to the stress and the burnout that leaders do face, especially under, like, that's why the human mind and the human body can't handle that much stress for that long. And then you also saw her building and developing other leaders. So throughout this series, she really did demonstrate all the different aspects of leadership and that someone should do throughout their leadership journey.
Yeah, one of the other things that I think I found so interesting when you're trying to run in parallel zombie apocalypse to sort of real life is not only so you met her as becoming a new leader, but I thought it was a very interesting snapshot of real life where she was in a pre-established organization, right? The little colony settlement that they had a system, a process for mercy, food, water, very stable environment. And through change, right, she became a leader. She came in on a new group that was, there were some folks that knew each other. There was also people that were totally brand new. There were people that were fully remote, like when we look at Citizen Z. And I thought that was really interesting because I look at my own career, right, and leaving one organization, moving to another. Normally, not always, but in my case, right, a lot of times when I've changed organizations, it's been for a promotion raise, a positional raise, right? So, and you fall into these new groups, new offices, where sometimes it's a brand new line of work that's being stood up within a company. So you run into those same things, right? You might have people that were previous coworkers together that work really well together, that have a niche, that understand each other. You have remote workers. Nobody really knows anybody. You're trying to feel everyone out. So I thought that was really interesting. And then as we arc through the story with her, you have old teammates that go away, that come back. You have new teammates that come in that mesh in really well. You have other teammates that fall into the group that don't really stick around that long. They don't mesh well with the core group. So I thought that parallel there for her as a leader was really, really interesting, because she also was, as the leader, the sort of established that main goal and mission, right? Get Murphy to California. She was the consistency of that mission and tone across the board. And I thought that was interesting from, we've talked about it a lot throughout the series of sort of change management and things like that, of, kind of what the importance, why it's good to treat your employees and your leaders well, to try to keep some semblance of stability there, right? And in my profession, a lot of that time that comes down to documentation, right? It's that they don't rely on people because it is such a turbulent work environment. So they rely heavily, heavily on documentation. And I just think about how the loss of the why, or the with them, if we were to, if Warren just wrote down in a book, right, we got to get Murphy to California because the government that semi-exists still, you need her sail, you need her passion for the mission to motivate those other people to literally walk across the entirety of the country. So that was a big, I know we were talking about things that I take away. We want to talk about that a little later, but one of the big things for me was especially the people aspect of a mission, and the passion for that, and why that's so important.
I appreciate everything you just said. So +1 to all of that. I think too, what the other piece that's highlighted there is, it's a leader's responsibility to get the mission done. And you do that through caring about people, but also by this clear communication of what is the mission, what exactly are we doing, reiterating that. Like, there was never a point where she, at least outward to everyone else, didn't believe that that was the right thing to do. So I think that a lot of times people, they let themselves get hamstrung by all these different things going on, but true leaders, they don't deal in petty stuff, they squash it. Right. So it doesn't matter if you leave and come back. It doesn't matter if you're brand new to the organization. It doesn't matter if you're having a bad day. Whatever it is, as a leader, it's your responsibility to move the organization towards that end goal or that mission. And I think that she did that so well. And just like you said, as people came in or whatever, it was like, no, you're part of this group. You're part of this group. And that also, that element that she had a lot of times, even though we've talked about how it didn't always work out, they didn't often, I should say, leave groups and other organizations better than they found them. They, in fact, left them much worse. But we believe this is the right thing, right? And like trying to help, even though, and I think this is so true in real life. Oftentimes we're like, I'm trying to help, and you just made things bad. You made them a lot worse. So, but not letting that stop them from what they believed was the right thing to do, and not letting that stop them from the mission. So I think that her leadership qualities there, that adaptability, that change management, really, in everything she said, in every interaction she had. And Susan Scott, in her book, Fierce Conversations, she talks about how the conversation is the relationship. And I think that Roberta Warren's character really embodied that, where it was like, when she was talking to Murphy because he was upset after the Grand Canyon thing, and he was upset about all the zombies, being, put into the Grand Canyon because they would be, killed or stuck there.
Mercied.
Yes, he was being mercied. But she met him on that human level. And then even with El Scorpion, who he was like, oh, like my past is always going to find me and all that. And she's like, I need a person like you, right? So that also, that belief in people and knowing how to reach people where they are and bring them into the fold, and do that in a very honest way that is also helping your mission. Like, people do have a lot to add. And sometimes I've seen leaders feel like, oh, well, that's manipulative to do this. No, like, you need to get to know people and know what their strengths are so you can leverage that in different things. we're at work, right? Like we work together. I need to know what your work strengths are. And if there are other things in your life that prevent those strengths from being able to be used, I need to know that too, as much as someone's comfortable telling you about that. And I think Roberta does that very well.
Yeah, I absolutely. And one of the other things too, like and I had scanned through just a few of the episodes where I thought it might have been said and I'd never heard it. So I can't say this definitively, but one thing at least that does not stick to memory is one of the things I really liked about Warren. She never used the term like we're a family, right? And I think we've talked about that before, either on the podcast or just personally, about sort of like the cringe factor of when leaders like we're like a big family here. No, we're not. We're not. So that's also I don't right? I don't want to be. So I really thought that from a leadership perspective too, prime example where she could try to tug at people's heartstrings of like the manipulation aspect that some leaders take with that comment of we're a family, right? They don't mean it like kumbaya. They mean it like you can put in the extra effort because we're a big family here, and like you can just volunteer that time because it's family and it'll come back around. Never does, spoiler. But I really liked that, like you had said, she was forceful yet fair in her decisions and how she approached people, and she treated everyone like an adult, right? Even with Murphy, right? A lot of times is acting overwhelmingly childish. And instead of meeting him at that level or doing the whole like, well, if you want to act like a child or treat you like one, no, she just decided that that was unacceptable, that everyone was adults and she was going to treat them that way. And that was the stern course correct for when people tried to go off script.
It reminds me, there was an individual who was speaking poorly about a program that I had developed. And this was a while back. And it was interesting because somebody was like, oh, well, do you want to know about this? And I was like, I actually don't. Right. Because there's that whole saying, like, when people go low, you go high. But my thing is like, when people go low, I don't care what they're doing. I'm a leader. I'm going to continue to move forward. And your wretched behavior doesn't change what I need to do and how I behave. Because then I'm just at the whim of my emotions and your emotions. And then it's this whole thing where nothing is getting done. And so I like what you said there, because that was definitely like more of a Warren type thing too, where it's like, we're going to keep moving forward, right? It's just, I understand that you don't like it. I understand that you're upset about it. I understand that you're trying to physically or verbally attack me. And that's fine. Like, you can feel that way. I don't change based on the winds of your change. And I really, maybe I was inspired more by Warren in those moments than I thought.
Yeah, and not to jump off of Warren, but
No.
when you're talking about sort of people that ran or run with her, when you look at when I don't exactly remember the episode where Hammond, I guess it was kind of episode 1 or 2, right? But Lieutenant Hammond, who was originally earlier on, brings forward the mission of like Murphy's got to get to the CDC lab in California. I thought that was really neat too, because Warren asserted herself as a leader, right, in like a very respectful way, and they co-led pretty well together. And I know earlier on we had talked about sort of the militaristic aspect of them both having that common background, and so there was a shared better communication there, I think, because they were on that same vocabulary, same understanding. And I thought it was really cool how much she, over the course of this series, evolved away from that militaristic leadership style. But even in that moment of the hybrid leadership thing, which you don't really get too terribly often, in my experience, in the military, of two people of kind of equal levels, sort of working together, making those decisions together. And also how much they quickly adapted, realizing that system wasn't going to be effective with the resources that they had, and so they they leveraged the strengths, right? The good parts that they could still use, but then formulated new leadership styles and tactics moving forward with the group. And so I know everyone always says like, oh, adaptability is important as a leader, but I think looking at that and realizing that doesn't mean you throw out everything and start start from fresh. It means nope, you make a decision, or you pick a style, for lack of a better term. You stick with that style, but you're not so rigid to it, right? But you at some point you have to have you got to have something, because even if it's wrong, it's better than getting into that paralysis by analysis phase of what would the right decision be, which so I thought that was interesting too.
And what I like about what you said there too is just reminded me that some people are like, oh, well, this person's not adaptable. And you're like, are they not adaptable, or are they just not doing what you want? Because those are two different things that also come up a lot, where people are like, oh, this person isn't adapting. And you're like, they're not adapting to what you want, but maybe they're still moving forward with what they're supposed to be doing. So I think there's also that too, where, and I've seen this a lot. I've seen this with words like, or phrases like psychological safety, words like accountability, where people can't tell you what that is to them. They use it as, they paint with this broad brush. People aren't accountable. They aren't held accountable. And it's like, okay, well, what is accountable? What is adaptable? And they're like, oh, it's like, you're like, you don't know. So I think that sometimes too, when there are like these bigger words where you're like, that sounds great. And then you're like, awesome. Now, what does that mean to you? And so I completely agree that, yeah, with whoever Warren was working with or co-leading with, she was able to not betray herself, like you said, but adapt to, this is what we need to do to keep this moving forward. And I think that that's, yeah, such a critical component.
Yeah, so that was kind of the big things. I mean, you could talk for hours and hours and hours, I think, about Warren, but I think one of the biggest takeaways from her as a leader, one of the benefits that she had, and you can make that benefit for yourself, I think, in your own organization, is it was easy. Get Murphy to California. It was clear cut and concise. So when you talk about accountability, when you talk about buy-in, when you talk about people understanding what the goals are, they're, in the instance of the show, it was the zombie apocalypse. There were no more goals. There was no 9 to 5. There were no more days of the week. It was all chaos. So, I think we always talk about people sort of, and the royal societal we, right? It's like, people want some structure to their life, to their day. And so the fact that she was able to provide that so clearly as this is the goal, people were willing to go along with it. And I think when you fall in an organization, I think like software development or anything, right? When you start to chunk things out and say, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, you're giving people some order, right? You're giving them an end state. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's just easier to like go along with that. You know what I mean? Because you see the value that your work is providing. So that was a huge takeaway for me, because a lot of times you start to think abstractly, right? You have these big goals, lofty goals of what the end state is, right? Those milestone pieces. But from the agile perspective, I think people oftentimes get muddy in the middle, right? They know what code needs to be written, what needs to be tested, but it's that middle piece of how do we move that big needle forward, because that little work is just drops, right? So how do we put those drops into cups that the bucket looks like it's actually filling up? And so I thought that was pretty interesting.
I know I've said it a bunch of times in this series, and I say it everywhere all the time, and that's like clarity is more important than people think it is. And it's not micromanagement. It's just being very clear as to what it is that we're trying to do, or what it is we're trying to be, and then letting people figure out that how. But you're absolutely right. Like that, like Roberta Warren was so clear. And then, yeah, to kind of like dovetail into the next one, the next two, actually, Hammond, who you already brought up. I think that Hammond is was such a great example of what militaristic leadership looks like, because it is rigid in the sense of like, we're moving towards this thing. This is how I'm going to do that. And that's just how that's going to be, or this is how we do it. That's how it's going to be. And then also, again, in parallel to him was Charles Garnet. And so I have somebody else who was kind of more another military person, but also more on the like, let me adapt to this. So you saw when Hammond first brought Murphy to them, Garnet was more like on the Hammond side of a little bit more aggressive, a little bit rougher with Murphy, a little bit more like, just do it. You don't need to know the why. Right. And I don't think Warren really ever operated from that place, like when she was in a leadership position. But what I thought was so interesting about Hammond and Garnet was that, yeah, as they initially, and Hammond for his entire time, it's just like, do what I tell you to do, salute and execute. Like that's what this is. But then we see Garnet start to evolve differently, just as he realize, and this happens to a lot of people. You see a spreadsheet and you're like, oh, we need to cut costs. Oh, well, these are the highest costs. Let's cut those costs. And you're like, oh, those costs are people, that's labor, right? But it's easy to do when you like don't have the whole like, oh, now I'm talking to this human being and this person. And so, you have Murphy in this who is being treated a certain way by Hammond. And then Garnet kind of starts to do that. So Murphy continues to behave like a child. And then you see Garnet kind of be like, okay, I actually like, we need relationships in this. We need to figure this out in a different way. He never fully came around. Garnet never fully came around to the side that Roberta Warren was on, as far as like bringing people in, making sure they know know what they're contributing. But I thought that those two characters are really interesting just because of, it was almost like you start with this Hammond type aggressive leadership going into and then Garnet was the Venn diagram that bridged that gap into Roberta Warren's leadership.
Do you think that it was easier for, or I guess harder, I should say, right? It was harder for Hammond to adjust the same way that Garnet did because Hammond was initially given that directive, like he was the whole, like he was the mission was given to him, right? Garnet was in support of that mission, but I would assume he didn't have the same, like, not passion, but do you get what I'm trying to get at though?
I do. So I think it's personality driven. And I know like these are two characters on a TV show. Totally got it. But if you look at like the military, there's some people who they soldierize to the military so well. Like, tell me what to do. I'm going like right place, right time, right uniform. Here are your orders. Go and do that thing. Don't deviate from that. That's all you have to do. And some people thrive in that kind of environment. And then also when you're only in that kind of environment, it makes it easier to thrive and to continue to do that. So I think maybe part of the difference too with Garnet was that he was out here among regular non-military people. And with that approach does not work with most people outside of the military, because it just doesn't, for a number of reasons. That could be an episode all its own. So I think that sometimes even just that exposure, where it's like, I'm not even this exposure to the benefit of my military mission, but just that exposure to different people and how you have to approach that was what helped Garnet, like, actually, I think, kind of bridge that gap between the two, because he still totally understood where Hammond was coming from. So did Roberta, but also it was like, but that actually doesn't work.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with humans. You're not dealing with supplies, you're dealing with people, and people don't like that. And so the best way to get buy-in is to meet people where they are. And in the military, that's not, in my experience in the military, that was not, I never heard those words, meet them where they are. It's like, do this, that's it, don't question it.
Well, yeah, I also thought it was interesting. So, Hammond had already sort of gone away at this point, but the other thing I thought was interesting, like a strength that and this is sort of an overarching thought. I'm all over the map today. I can't
All
make a
good.
concise sentence. I apologize. Uh, uh, the thought will come back to me. I swear. Don't give up on me.
I won't.
So there was Hammond didn't have any additional resources, right? His structure had collapsed, right? So the military supply chain thing had collapsed, but because Warren and a lot of the other folks, they had other additional resources, and that is what I think was also a key strength that they played off of, and they used was those like sort of professional relationships. So I can't think of what his name was. Major in the little compound village thing.
I don't remember his name, but I remember. Yeah, I remember the major.
Major something or other, right? That was like a resource, right? That was a great place that like that was something that they had. Doc with Sleazy and Skeezy, right? There was all these other supporting infrastructures because the group wasn't, it was self-sufficient to a point, but it still needed additional resources, skills, and expertise. So I just think sometimes you build out, and I again, looking as still a relatively young leader, you start to try to build out a team, right? You have finances and you're trying to get the right resources because you want this team to be self-sufficient, because that's what all the sort of leadership books tell you, right? Is you want a small, agile, self-sufficient team. That's most of the time when you also have a budget to come to play with, that's almost impossible. So it becomes really important to maintain relationships with outside skill and expertise that you can bring in to fill in gaps. So I thought that was really well highlighted as well.
And then even though I don't know that I would say that this person had a dramatic leadership arc in the series, I'm just tying this person in now because of the military connection, and that was Sarge. And so obviously we met her in later seasons, but what was interesting was very much like do as you're told. And that's what she did. She was a Marine and identified with that very closely. And then like as that world, kind of like you said, like with Hammond, as those resources fall away, as those people that you're used to talking to that are part of that group fall away, it becomes a different thing where you have to adapt to connect with the people around you. So like I said, I wouldn't say she had this giant like leader arc, but she did have that adapt, like that need to adapt to something different that I think Hammond attempted and that Garnett and Roberta mastered.
Yeah, I think it's when you talk about that, if we just if we say like military to non-military leadership, but yeah, it's really like leadership style A to leadership style B. What I also think is really interesting is you sort of see three different paths to get to the same point. So you have Hammond, who's sort of, and Warren, they're adjusting very quickly on the fly, right? They're doing it live. You have Sarge, who kind of holds on till the bitter end and then slowly starts to hybridize and make the transition. And then at least so I have you had Sun Mei, who military through and through. That song plays, mission is dead, and then now she's just all on board on the other way. So it's like a clear like turn of the page, black and white, right? You can see the very moment when she made that switch. But again, similar to Sarge, sort of till the dying breath of that system came, was in that way. And so I thought that was really interesting when you're looking at that, because then I don't know how would you say from like a, I guess like organizational change or change management, new leadership comes in, something like that, you got three different sort of examples that you can look at of people. So it's like, I'm sure some people are just like, whatever, man, just here for the paycheck. This is the way we're doing it now. Cool. I'm doing it that way. And so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I think in most organizations, at least the studies that have been done, I mean, there are a few people, kind of like your bottom 10%, who are going to cling on to what was because the change is too scary for them. They don't understand it. maybe because it wasn't explained well, but also maybe because they don't want to understand it. They liked the way things were before. They're worried that it's going to change their status or how they're viewed or where they sit, or, you know, people worry about a lot of things that they probably wouldn't normally vocalize. And then you have like the top 10% who are on board. Those are your early adapters, and they are like, we get it. We understand why this change needs to happen. They're kind of like your champions for the change in the organization. Yeah. And then there are a lot of people who are like, I don't have a say in this anyway. So what do you need me to do? Right. And again, this kind of goes back to the clarity thing. Just tell people what you want, you know, what you need them to be, what you need them to do, and then let them figure out how to do those things. And most people will adapt, but yeah, you will have those clingers who stay. But I love that you brought up Sunmay, because I think that her leadership was unique and that she wasn't necessarily leading people. She was at first because it was kind of her job, but she's essentially this intelligence officer. And then it was actually like her intelligence that made her a leader in certain things. She had this amazing expertise, and that was how she led. She didn't need to be a people leader. She led through this technical ability that she had. And so I think that she's just another great example of, you don't have to lead people to be a great leader. You probably will at some point, but leadership is like we say in the intro, it's all around us. And so something that you're really good at, you don't need to try to stick to that skill forever, because skills change and things adapt. But the expertise that you offer to your organization is another aspect of leadership.
Yeah, no. Also, great call out to the intro. Just saying, that was great tie-in. Really, we're telling a story here. But I viewed Sunmay too as being like the most effective follower. Because I think given the need in this instance, right, or the opportunity in sort of the real world, she could have been a very effective leader for the group, right? It would have been a different version than Warren. But I think ultimately, if when we were introduced to her, if there was a shift and Warren went away and Sunmay had to take over, I think the story would have played out relatively similar, right? As far as the end state goes, I think Murphy would have ended up in California. I think the group would have probably got there safely as they did otherwise. I think that she was very effective she didn't try to bully her way into that position. She accepted that she was going to follow because, again, agreed with the mission, agreed with the goals. It was similar to what she wanted to do anyway. So, and I also think it takes a lot of maturity and self-awareness to also, though she never outright said it, I think she also acknowledged that her approach to that failed. And so maybe she didn't have the best, her thought process or style wasn't the best to get the mission done, and saw the effectiveness of Warren and was, keyed into that and used her strengths to bolster Warren's goals.
Yes. And Warren made the space for her to do that.
Exactly,
Warren didn't need to be the large and in charge person. She pulled in those strengths. Like, you're on my team now, is what she said to Sunmay. Another person who I think did a good job of, and here's another Venn diagram person where they did a great job of leading with their knowledge, and sometimes they did lead people, and that was Addie Carver. And so, she was, she's a very powerful character. But a lot of, especially initially in those first several seasons, she was essentially a comms person, right? She knew she had this technical ability that truly helped the group, and that she was always focused on that and always contributing to the group in that way. And then she also had this added benefit of essentially being mentored by Warren. Warren was definitely setting her up to be a leader in a lot of ways, and then trusting her to lead certain missions and certain things. And so I think that Addie, her character arc was super interesting, because then she becomes part of, leading this underground thing of the Talkers as we get to those later seasons. So probably would not have been able to get there had she not had leadership like Warren's, who was supportive, showing her what good leadership was, And then Addie really taking that internally and seeing that it's like, oh, yep, I'm a comms person. I'm being trusted to lead these different types of missions. And then being able to be like fully formed and functional on her own.
Yeah, that is I see. I didn't forget that she was the comms person, but that's an interesting point where you talk about the evolution of folks on the team because I don't think there was ever really cross training, but if we follow that hypothetical, right? Because it was sort of 10K was like physical security, Doc was, medication and medic type thing. You had Addie, who was, like you said, comms and really all things sort of technical. And then, they end up getting Citizen Z in there, who also helped out from like a technical, but also like intelligence perspective. So they had their little core unit, and you start to see all of them jump around a little bit. You know what I mean? And that they mingle. They're observing. They're learning from each other, right? Co-location, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's great. But Addie, like you said, was I, I think that as that every time her confidence would waver a little bit, Warren was always there to be supportive, and there's never like a negative critique, right? It was never you did this wrong. It was always, let me show you how to do that this way, the right way, a different way. But there was never any like call out, which I think gave her a really safe space. And I also think it was cool because the team respected that, right? Understood the importance of having somebody else who could make those decisions. Because I looked a lot into that whole effective follower thing early on in my career, because I was fascinated by the concept, because I didn't think that was praised or valued enough in the system that I was in, right? That somebody was willing just to go along and do that, and that was always frowned upon. And I think that situations like Addie, it shows the importance of that, because you're someone who's willing to move with the group, realize that one decision is going to move faster and more effectively. And so yeah, I think her ability to grow was only amplified by having a team that was receptive and supportive of her growth.
And I think there are 3 other characters that I also kind of bucket in the same way. And that is Citizen Z, and then Doc, and then 10K. And so probably in that order, because I feel like Citizen Z, similar to Addie, where he had all these different inputs, a little bit more self-sufficient because he was that remote employee who didn't have the ongoing guidance of Warren, but he had it sometimes. But he was the intelligence person, giving them all the different information. And then he did emerge into doing things on his own, completely independent of the group and leading these other things. And yes, his, spouse or partner, Kaya, definitely was supportive in that and in showing him different aspects of the world. But I think that he is another one who excellent follower, excellent, like, I'm here to do this job. Let me do this job as well as I can do it. That's what's helpful. And ultimately, okay, I don't want to get on a soapbox about this, but ultimately that's also that like self-leadership, like
That's exactly
part of me helping this mission go well. Someone is, kind of dictating and saying what needs to happen and all of that, but me being part of that and actually doing my best is a form of leadership and is a form of moving this team forward. Because if I don't, they don't have the intelligence they need in this, like Citizen Z, Doc, they don't have the medication or the insight that they need from him. We don't have communications. So we can't be successful. So you have to lead, from the position that you're in.
Yeah, as my big thing with Citizen Z too was like you said, so it's that self-leadership, but I also think it's you're right. He did not have that direct, like one-on-one constant feedback from Warren or anyone else, but he was observant and like he's self-taught. You know what I mean? He looked at the situation around him. He was able to objectively, from like that remote location, but close enough, he's able to look at it. He was able to, analyze and think critically about those things. and develop into, somebody now would, we get into those later episodes and he's really involved, right? He's doing media. He's kind of like the new journalist for Numerica. You know what I mean? He's doing all the media broadcasts. And now he's become like this sort of political analyst, right? Who's, discussing and has a huge impact on how the Numerica is being formed and everything. So I think that was, yeah, like you'd said, you had two different things. You had Addie getting that constant leadership guidance, right? Spot corrections, and you had somebody else who was still emerging and growing as a leader, but kind of self-taught in a way.
Yes. And then from there, moving on to Doc, who I think Doc was such a human-centered leader. He embodied that so well. Human-centric leadership has that empathy, that adaptability, and that authenticity. And Doc was that in spades in every interaction. But he also took very much a followership role. But then there were times like when Warren wasn't there, when they were at the Mercy Labs, where he stepped up and he was the leader. And he was like, none of this nonsense. We're going to keep going and doing this thing that we were supposed to do, while still maintaining that the ways that he mentored 10K and the way that he cared for the other people in the group, I think was, again, great followership, but also great leadership. You got to have that person in the group. Maybe it's not the main leader. Sometimes the main leader can do that. Sometimes they can't. But that person who is essentially there, like, oh, Corey seems like he's feeling a little bit off today. I'm going to go check in with Corey. Right? Not everybody sees that, but a person like Doc, who I think we've all met a person like Doc before, where they see things because they care, and so they care enough to notice.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I also think Doc filled he added a strength that Warren, I think, was severely lacking. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that she wasn't, she lacked empathy or like emotional intelligence, but I don't think it was something that came super natural to her. Whereas Doc, like you said, it just came really, so that sort of, they interlocked well together. Cause I also don't think that Doc was the type of guy to make a hard command decision either. He seemed far more democratic in his processes. And as we saw, like you said, at the Mercy Labs, could make a sort of authoritative or determined decisions. But that also wasn't his unique idea, right? He was saying, we're going to do what Warren said we were going to do. So he was able to continue to enforce that. But I think that is also key, right? Is that they were not opposite sides of the same coin, but that they worked really well together in that regard. They complemented each other well.
Yes. And I think that's another thing that leaders should just be very aware of is, like you said, whether she didn't have the time or the bandwidth or the ability to do those things, Warren didn't do those things. Sometimes she did. You saw it kind of come out in certain times. But typically, you saw that empathy come out of her when things were much calmer.
Yeah.
Right. Like when something was over, then she took that moment to look around at everybody. Whereas Doc was always on the lookout for everyone else and how they were feeling and how they were showing up. So, yeah, I think that when leaders can also acknowledge that it's like, oh, wow, I'm not great at this. And then finding the people who are great at that again, and then letting them do their thing and respecting that role that they're playing, it makes the whole team better.
Yeah, that's so true. I also, now that you say that, I'm thinking about it, as you look at Addie as an emerging leader, right? The product of the environment for which you're growing in, she has a lot of those Warren aspects of kind of being a badass, right? But then overwhelmingly empathetic to people, right? And making sure that everyone's being treated fair. And you see that with Lucy, you see that, like you said, with the talker group. So I think that's pretty interesting too, that she was able to sort of get that TV show, right? But she got the best sides of both worlds to move forward with.
Something else that I really love about Doc's character that I wanted to bring up is people sometimes assume that the oldest person in the group is the leader. And in this case, obviously it wasn't. Doc was the oldest person in the group, but also he didn't want to be. And I think sometimes, and you kind of you touched on this a little bit earlier, where people sometimes assume that if you don't want to be the leader, if you don't want to be the most senior person, then you're not ambitious and they shouldn't waste time or resources on you. When in reality, what if you do want to be a great follower? What if you don't want to be the leader of a bunch of projects or programs or people, and you just want to be great at your job? And we need people like that. But unfortunately, I don't feel like I've found any type of industry that actually celebrates that, where it's like, oh, you're great at this type of development. We need that. Like, we need that. We need somebody who's great at it and is focused just on that. Have at it. And so I think that that's another reason why I love Doc's character, is he is like the forever individual contributor who is also, though, shows leadership in other ways, right? Like, just because you don't lead people, like I've already said, doesn't mean you're not a leader. And I think that Doc is another great example of that.
Yeah, yeah, nope, that's definitely, that is, I wouldn't say it's celebrated by the group, but right, it's accepted too. Nobody's like, this guy, doesn't want to take up the reins. But on the professional side too, you send people, people go to school for 4, 8 years for that skill that they want to do. Most of the time, that skill that they've learned in college, they put all that time and energy and resource in, is not the managing of those people and the budgets and their timesheets and HR and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I do think it's interesting how, because they choose to professionalize in that, it's frowned upon. And really, I think the only industries where you don't necessarily see that, and that's for me as an outside observer looking in, is if somebody's a doctor or a lawyer or a nurse. It's not like, oh, you don't want to be head nurse, you're terrible. Oh, you just like helping people. That's admirable, and that's okay, and we'll hire you and keep you around for 20 years. You know, so same thing with a carpenter, right? You're not mad because he's not running the IKEA furniture store. That's not his goal, ambition. He's just happy making cabinets. So
Yeah, exactly.
that's a sore point for me.
All right, so we'll pivot into 10K. 10K, truly the forever individual contributor, excellent follower. I personally did not feel like he had this great leadership arc.
No.
I think he had some good self-development arcs and self-awareness arcs, but at no point was I like, oh yeah, 10K is the leader of whatever. But kind of like you mentioned earlier, that guy was security. And to what we were just talking about, his name was 10K because he wanted to mercy 10,000 zombies. Like, that was his thing. And again, the group let him do that. And then he was focused on that. So no matter what was going on, even when he lost his hand and they were trying to figure out like, oh yeah, how do we get it so that he can still hold his rifle? That like, they all still were very supportive of the fact that like, he's an individual contributor, great follower. That's the limits of what this person is interested in right now.
Yeah, I also think the important thing with 10K from a leadership perspective too was, and I don't mean this in an ageist way or anything else, but like, he was also the youngest member of the group. And so if you look at that too, I would not necessarily expect who's ever joining an organization, either fresh from college or fresh from like an apprenticeship or anything like that, I don't think that they should be expected to lead yet, because there's a lot of or that you should expect them to want to lead yet, right? I guess the better way to put it, because there's they've got to learn the organization. There's a lot to learn there. And for 10K, I think even in the zombie aspect of it, he had an itch to scratch first, right? Like you said, the 10K piece. So he had a goal, a mission. It was going to be conducive to the organization anyway. And so let's let him work on that. And, come 9,500, maybe we need to start assessing, with him, is he trying to go for 20, or, does he want to switch roles? And I think that the group did a really good job of that.
Agreed. One of the characters that had a very interesting arc and not necessarily in leader development, but going from a leader to an individual contributor was El Scorpion.
Yeah.
Because he was the leader of this essentially mafia, if you will, of people and or one of the leaders of it. And then he kind of saw the light for himself, and the structure that he had, kind of similar again to Hammond and Sarge, where it's like the structure kind of fell away. It wasn't what he thought it was, and he knew he needed to switch. So he changed perspective. But I think it's kind of also then similar to Sun Mei, where it's like, this is over. I'm not that anymore. Now I'm this new thing. And he embraced that. He struggled a little bit, but then he really embraced that role of individual contributor after being the leader. And I have not in real life seen someone ever do that successfully.
Yeah, no, that's, the benefits of a TV show, I guess, but that's the, what I also think, like you said, like he saw that what he was doing was wrong, but I also think he didn't see that it was wrong until it failed, right? So you kind of get not a cop out, but I think there was and I don't disagree with you at all, but I think in this situation especially, there's sort of a survivalist instinct, right? Like it's not fight or flight, it's continue, or it's adapt, or it cease existing. You know what I mean? So I think that probably the fear or the outcome of not existing anymore is probably a pretty big motivator to adapt quickly. But I don't think that's unlike I work in an organization, I get laid off or I get fired and I lose my income, and now I need to really quickly adapt and to a different team. So I think it's a great point that you bring up, though, because he buys in all the way, and you're talking about a complete going from sort of exploiting people, like you said, this mafia style cronyism, to just attempting to do for the greater good. That's a huge, shift.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So yeah, El Scorpion, who else do I have on here? I guess we'll save that the best for last there, but well, your best. Yeah, the only other thing that I had was sort of some of the we'll call them villains, right? So you had like, it was less about them as leaders, right? Like you had the Man, you had Dr. Xavier, some of those other folks, like that was I think it was more the learning experiences of what not to do, or what wrong looks like, that they provided to some of the leaders, as well as like the opportunities. So if you look at them, I guess if you look at them less as bad guys and more as challenges, I think it's important to be challenged in leadership, because I think it provides some of the best opportunities for growth. And I think that was sort of the reflection that I got from a lot of the trials and tribulations that they got, or even what are they, juggalos, I think they're called, right? Like some of those weird little niche one-off episodes where it didn't really have a lot to talk about to expose the leadership of what some of the main characters were doing, or like Warren was doing. But I think that those experiences obviously really affected the way that they led. So I thought that was interesting.
I agree. And I mean, I think some people could say that they've met people at work that they would call their maybe nemesis or a super villain. I mean, hopefully they get over that or talk to a therapist. But I think that you're absolutely right, though. There is the matter of, you are a leader, someone else is a leader. You're fighting essentially for the same resources, or I should say contending for. There shouldn't necessarily be a fight. But sometimes, depending on how aggressive someone else is or isn't, causes you to show up differently. It's a different type of challenge, where maybe you think somebody isn't being as honest about what they need, or they're just steamrolling everyone else and not listening. Like those, and that's essentially, if we kind of like take it out of like the TV world, obviously they're very extreme characters, but somebody like the Man, he's like, I just have this list. I just need these people. you need to give me these people. That's what I need to get my stuff done. And if you think about it in an organization, you're like, I only have so many, so much headcount, and you can't have mine because I need it. And they're like, no, I need that one. And so it's like just kind of those parallels. You're right, where there are these challenges that leaders come up against, and there's so many different things that go into that. So I liked your reframe there of from bad guys to challenges.
Yeah. No, because the only other, like, so you had the challenges there, and then the other thing was, if you look at Sleazy and Skeezy, who are like two of my favorite, just like one-off recurring characters of any television show, they're like this annoyance that it's like they have the mission, and the goal is to get Murphy to California. These guys keep popping up, so they're like little side taskers. You know what I mean? Like, that's like, if you look at it, like Warren's running a team, they're doing something, and then get these little side tasks. And I think that Warren and the team themselves do a really great job of like, they entertain those annoyances to a point. They understand the importance, right? Even if it's just like, I don't know, forwarding the spam email, right? Or the reply alls and those sort of things. Those time wasters that they have a place, right? A certain amount of time that's devoted to them because they could be beneficial, right? They give you that break, that moment of like mental relaxation and that comic relief. And I thought that they were interesting. Like I said, not really leaders, but yeah, let's be easy on them. Okay.
Let's not.
Yeah.
They would be fired immediately
Yeah.
if they were in my organization.
Oh, see, no fun, right? No fun. But
no, I know what you mean. And yeah, that's a good correlation that there are some people who are trying to distract you from what you're trying to get done. So how do you gracefully handle that because when you squash other people, even if it's to the benefit of your team, that will cause fear on your team, that it's like, oh, if I go against what Natasha wants, and is she going to do that to me? Right.
Apparently in Natasha Corporation.
I mean, yeah.
Play back the tape.
But yeah, so it's a matter of how you deal with those things gracefully.
Yeah, no, for sure. For sure.
All right, let's talk about Murphy. I'm the biggest Murphy sympathizer. You know that. So we have Murphy, who against his will, was a prisoner within the government's prison system. And they used an experimental vaccine, and he was bitten by 6 zombies. And so then he's in the custody of Hammond, is traded over to the custody of Garnett and Warren. They're trying to get him to California. He's a whiny baby through most of season 1, in the sense of he doesn't want to. I sympathize because he never asked for these things, and now he's literally being taken. He's a prisoner still, being taken prisoner across the country against his will for something he never signed up for. And then we see him start to not self-advocate, but kind of get this weird sort of like self-efficacy where he's like, oh, they need me. They need me to get this done. I'm the most important thing. And now I'm learning that I don't need them as much, and I can kind of do this thing on my own. And he becomes this tyrannical leader, which is a very typical arc for any person who is treated very poorly by leaders. They kind of want to be in leadership positions because of the power that they believe that position holds. Right. So typically, especially so backing away from the TV show for a second. So for a long time, people wanted to be in leadership positions because of the power, because of the perks of leadership. And now we're really moving into an era, probably for the past decade or more, of people want to be leaders because they want to care about people. They actually care about other people and want to help move them forward. And so, but Murphy was definitely in that first era of, I want this power. And then when he sees what having power and being in charge entails, he's like, gross. And then other things came up, of course, but also he realized it was a lot more, even though all these people, he had bitten them. So they could read his mind. They were going to do whatever. And then we see another phase where he kind of figures out what it is that he wants to contribute. That's not him being forced to contribute, but a legitimate contribution to the community or to society. And then the ways that he finds that he's a leader in that, where he's helping the talkers have a voice in voting and all that kind of stuff. So I just think it's really interesting. If you look at like season 1, Blue, whiny Murphy, who just is pissed off about everything. And then in season 5, where now you have red, leather clad Murphy, who's literally leading a group of talkers to have the right to vote. So it's just I think his story is such an interesting arc, and not just because I'm a Murphy sympathizer, but because that is a lot of growth, because there were a lot of trip ups that he had through most of the time before he realized like, oh, I actually, now he didn't say this out loud, but it's like, oh, I actually need to be authentic. I need to show up for myself. I need to, self-advocate. I can advocate for others. And he had little snippets of that throughout, but he never fully leaned into it until we get to the later seasons.
Yeah, I think the later season Murphy, I think he's my favorite, especially once he gets Limbo, the
Mhm.
bar, because that's the exact, and I'm talking about this in relation to the television show, but like a bar manager is exactly who he needs to be, right? Like it's not easy in real life. I know this, but I'm talking about in the context of the zombie thing. I don't want to get people angry at me, but in the context of like the zombie apocalypse, a bar manager is perfect for him, right? He can gamble, so he's got creative freedom because he's a creative guy. He can come up with events and shows, right? Which is a huge strength for him. Minimal sort of bookkeeping because there's no more money, right? It's, a bullet or a biscuit for a beer type sort of situation. So it's like real easy leadership. And he's also surrounded by sort of his first bitees from that first attempt in, was it Seattle? Wherever
Mhm.
the Murphy town was originally, or Murphyville. Those original bitees that, right, are totally hook, line, and sinker for him. So it's like it's a great place for him. And he's doing good, right? Like you said, he had this great sort of emotional change and arc. So now he's able to be himself to the truest form, right? So he gets to be the entertainer, gets to have all the fun, gets to be the boss, and he also gets to help people, right? So it's like perfect ending for him.
And I think too, when someone, now this is not necessarily what happened, but I'm just follow me with this. The leadership that he saw with the military thing, and then when he has his Murphy town, he's trying to create this dictatorial type society. And I think what's interesting is that then when he gets the fast forward to the Limbo, club or bar, it's him realizing that like that style of leadership was not for him. He hated it. And even though he thought it would bring him all this power, he didn't like it. That wasn't who he was. So I think that, like you said, like he's not only leaning into his strengths, but like this is authentically who he is and the style that he wants to be in the world. And if more leaders can find that and accept that, which is scary, like it's very scary in real life, probably for him on the show, but it's very scary to think like, this is what I know, and this is what I've seen. This is what I'm trying to follow. And it's, I'm making a living doing that, and I'm doing all these things. So to think that like, how far outside of that do I need to stretch to find my authentic style and how I want to show up and what I actually want to do? That is really, really scary for a lot of people. So they often don't, right? They'll just kind of keep going along with the system. And so that's another thing why I really loved that arc, where it was just so different. Like he was not whining about anything. He was advocating for himself and for others, hiding people from big government orgs where before he would have just thrown them under the bus. So it's just interesting how you learn how to stand up for yourself and others and really care about people when you're actually doing something that feels more authentic to who you are.
Yeah, authenticity is the key word from all of this. You know what I mean? Like if you had to pick a word, is once you started like that authenticity quickly shows whether you're right or wrong, right? Like the right fit, the wrong fit, and that's fine. And if you're the wrong fit, you're never penalized for that, right? Your other strengths shown through. And I think that is what also made them very effective, was they weren't consistently uh not burning bridges, but they weren't like getting rid of people, right? Left, right, and center because, oh, you're kind of messed up. Nope, we're gonna adapt the system for you a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So those are our characters that we're talking about with their different like leadership arcs. Was there anything that you've changed in like how you approach work or how you approach or think about leadership that you kind of learned from this series?
Yes, right. One, because just being able to talk to you as someone with so much experience with leadership, and the show gives you the ability to look at situations that you could never think of. So I would definitely say, unrelated to everything, obviously somebody listening to the podcast is obviously going to be interested in leadership and that sort of thing. But I found from a thought exercise, taking something that was so absurd, right, like a zombie apocalypse, and trying to apply or understand or learn leadership, like, fundamental pieces. So even just things like, either it's like John Maxwell or Stephen Covey or anything like that, taking their thoughts and looking at something that has nothing to do with anything was so freeing, right? It was such a freeing exercise for trying to understand things and wrap your brain around it. I think Doc had his empathy and just sort of go with the flow attitude. That's something I struggle with, and it's something that I was also starting to realize a lot of the leaders that I worked with struggled with, because we're a very numbers driven organization where I am, or where I was, I should say. Well, I guess industry wide, right? We work with numbers, things are contracted, right? So it means you will do this for this number. The goal is to do it for less than that number, you know what I mean? And done faster. So you very quickly turn everything and everyone into a number, into an object, into a resource, right? You look at somebody for skills and not who they are. And, I think that was the biggest step back that I had, was, the people aspect.
Awesome.
How about you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. And so I think that what I appreciated was kind of just exploring how other leaders deal with things under immense stress. And again, it's a zombie apocalypse and all of that. So in general, I thought it was just like a fun concept to think about it. But then I think as we got more into it, I also got more into it where I was like, oh wait, yeah, like there's real team dynamics, there's real like leadership challenges in this. And so I think even just looking at that, where I got like a little sticker that's on my desk that says, what would Roberta Warren do? Where you just think about it like, yeah, like how do we move everybody through this reasonably? We're not forcing anybody through this process, but we need to get everybody through it. So how do we do that? How are we checking in on people? How are we including the voices of others? So I think that for me, it gave me maybe just some more tools to think about things, to think about any situation with like more frames, right? More lenses going into it. Whereas before I might have been just a little bit like, of course we're caring about people and we're moving towards this thing. And it's like, oh wait, but there are these other aspects to just consider. We don't need to spend a week on it, but make sure you're not forgetting these things. So I think for me, that was my biggest takeaway.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's, like I said, that the middle piece too was another big one for me. You can have the big goal, you can understand the small steps, making sure that everyone understands those middle chunks as well.
Yeah. And you keep reminding them. That's something too that I see in many organizations, but that's where like people stop communicating at some point because they're like, well, we told them. Tell them again and again and again. And just in all of your actions and all of your behaviors, make sure that you're reiterating those things. That helps people a lot. So again, you don't need to say it the same way every time, every day, but if you believe it, you'll express it in a lot of different ways. But yeah, and this was a lot of fun. I'm so happy that you agreed to do this series with me, Corey. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Oh, I can't wait for us to start up Game of Thrones next.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been fun.